Hi, well, thanks for joining me again. I'm Joseph B.H. Macmillan, and this is the second in a series of videos I'm doing called A Legal Proof for the Existence of God. What we're going to do in this video is go back to the beginning to see if there's any similarity between the accounts of the origin of the universe in Genesis and in science. Now, I just want to make at the outset a number of preliminary points. First is this: what Genesis gives us is the entire basis of mathematics, the mathematical equation. It does that by showing how something can be converted into something else while maintaining its value. The second thing Genesis does is establish those moral principles that underpin the laws of physics. And in day one, as we will see, what it does is give us freedom under the law, which also we'll see in later videos is the first commandment. The third thing I want to say is this, and it's something I mentioned in the previous video, but I'd like to emphasize. And that is what I will not be doing in these videos. We will not be adopting the intelligent design argument. So we're not simply going to substitute God with what science can't yet explain. But as we'll see, the interesting thing is Genesis does refer to the intervention of God in respect of those matters that science still can't explain. But the important point to note is it doesn't talk about the intervention of God as adding something to the universe or taking it away, but it's by establishing laws that govern the material that makes up the universe. The second thing we're not going to do is simply be saying the universe is so complex and improbable that it can only be explained by reference to a God. These intelligent design arguments risk portraying God as some nebulous notion, almost indistinguishable from a force of nature. But for God to have any real meaning, He has to be shown to be a God that is involved with good and evil, morality, and in that respect, I think I'd like to refer to a scientist, because I think he actually fits it best. And he's not a scientist that proposes that the laws of physics, the universe, were created by God. And this is what it's Steven Weinberg in his book Dreams of a Final Theory. And this is what Weinberg says God needs to be in order to have any meaning. He says he has to be shown to be an interested God, a creator and lawgiver, who has established not only the laws of nature and the universe, but also standards of good and evil, and is concerned with our actions. And what we're going to see is that is exactly what Genesis does. It shows that the laws that govern the universe are God's laws, and they reveal God's will. And it also shows that how those laws, those mathematical laws, are imprinted into our brains, and our brains, as we saw in the previous video, have the mechanisms to convert that mathematical data into concepts, words, and principles. And that reveals that the laws that govern the universe are underpinned by moral principles. And so let's go now and have a look at Genesis to see how that is done. And we'll deal first with day one in this video. Right, so let's go to Genesis and look at the first verse of chapter 1 and see what it says about how everything came into being. and it's very simple and concise. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Although that's simple, you'll see it's actually a very profound statement. But first we have to establish what does it mean by earth and heaven. Well, clearly earth doesn't mean planet Earth, because the very next verse tells us that the earth was without form and void. And clearly this earth isn't without form and void. And heaven clearly doesn't refer to the place where God's supposed to be, because it would be ridiculous for God to have to create his own abode. So heaven clearly refers to space, and that is confirmed as well in the next verse, and we'll see about that in a moment, because it talks about darkness being upon the face of the deep. Yeah, the deep clearly refers to space. But now why this is so profound is what Genesis is telling us is that everything that would make up the universe was there right at the beginning, and it's called heaven and earth. All of this was one dense ball of matter and space combined into one. That's what it's telling us, and we'll see why when we look at the next verse. Now science agrees 100% with that. Science says that all matter and space, that is the universe as we see it today, was once condensed into a little ball. It's called the gravitational singularity. Yeah, some say it was the size of a grain of sand, others say the size of a football, but they all agree it was all condensed into this one mass. So space and matter were all there, pulled together into this little ball, and even light could not escape. The space itself was just bent in, pulled in by this gravity. Now the only difference for this opening verse between science and Genesis is where this matter and space came from. Genesis clearly says God put it there. Science, well, they acknowledge they have no idea where it came from, and that's not surprising because we are as in a little box and we can't see what's outside. And Max Planck, the physicist, I think put it very well, and he said science cannot explain the ultimate mystery of nature, and it is because in the last analysis we ourselves are part of the mystery we are trying to solve. So there we see right at the beginning, the very first verse of Genesis makes it quite clear that it agrees 100% with science, except as to who put this material there in the first place that was going to make up the universe. Nothing was going to be added to this material, nothing was going to be taken away. It was everything that was going to make up the universe was there right at the start. So next what we want to do is have a look and see what Genesis says this matter and space look like, and see whether that coincides with what science understands this matter and space would have looked like. Right, so let's see how Genesis describes what matter and space looked like before anything was done to it. And verse 2 says this: "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep." Now first we have to distinguish these two parts of the verse. The first part is clearly referring to matter, the earth. The second part, darkness was upon the face of the deep, is talking clearly about space. And what it's telling us there is that it was all, as we saw in respect to the first verse, confined into this little space that was the size of a football or a grain of sand. And when it says the earth was without form and void, now that's interesting because it's talking about matter, but it says not only is it without form, it is void. Void should mean it doesn't exist. And as with space, clearly everything, including light, was brought in and confined in this little ball with the gravitational singularity. Now let's have a look and see how science describes these two elements, that is matter and space. And first, refer to Martin Rees in Just Six Numbers. And what he says about it is this, that matter and space in this beginning was an ultra-dense primal medium that was almost structureless. Now, structureless, or without form, and is basically exactly the same thing. And let's have a look at Brian Greene. He describes it in a very similar way. Yeah, first he says this: it was a highly disordered state of primeval chaos. And he goes on to describe it like this: a wild and energetic realm of primordial chaos with extremes of heat and colossal density, in which gravity was by far the dominant force. Now that sounds exactly like the description in the scriptures. And this question of the void is a very important one to remember, because we'll come to it in the next verse. Because clearly Genesis is saying it was void, but there was something there that you could work with. Okay. Now when we look at space, now you think, well, space and the universe are infinite. How could something that's infinite be confined in this little space? And that's something that science recognizes as well, because if you take infinity and you cut it in half, it's still infinite. It doesn't matter how many times you cut it in half, infinity is infinity. And let me refer again to Brian Greene on that particular one. And this is a good quote. And this is a good book. You especially read something like this with the scriptures, and things start making a lot more sense. And what he says is this: but if the universe is spatially infinite, there was already an infinite spatial expanse at the moment of the Big Bang. So the time we're talking about here, which is just before the Big Bang, we see they pretty much agree. So even though everything's confined into this little space, the universe space is still infinite. So what we have to look at next is what actually happened to transform this matter that was without form, or structureless, as Martin Rees calls it, and void. In other words, it didn't exist, but it existed. What happened to that to convert it into, by stages, into what we see today around us? And that's the next point we'll look at, and see what Genesis has to say about that and what science has to say about that. Right, so we've seen what matter and space look like. What we have to look at next is what characteristics did that matter and space have that enabled it to be transformed from this structureless void into what we see around us. And this is how Genesis describes the next step. It says, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. The waters. the first thing you have to ask is, well, where did the water suddenly come from? We had space and matter. Now we're talking about water. And of course, people love mocking this verse because they say, well, water only appeared on earth relatively recently, so this is nonsense. But that ignores a literary technique used throughout Genesis, and we'll see as we move through. It takes what has been described before and re-describes that in order to convey some meaning as to what that constituted. And here all we have is matter and space, this stuff that was without form and void and condensed into a little ball, actually had all the properties necessary to create the universe as we see it. And on that, let me quote again from Martin Rees, because we're talking here about a void, and we hear a lot today from scientists about how the universe was created from nothing. And the strange thing is they mock the account in Genesis by saying, well, it could account for how things came into being. It came into being from nothing. Well, Genesis says exactly that. The stuff that we're working with here was void and structureless. But the fact that it's void doesn't mean it has no properties. This is what Martin Rees says about that. And he's referring to discoveries by Einstein and so on about empty space. And he says, the universe, even if shrunk to a point, it is latent with particles and forces. And he goes on to say, I should just mention this as well, he cautions scientists then from claiming that the universe can arise from nothing, because even nothing has the potential to transform into something else. And the remarkable thing is, again, there's Genesis saying this matter and space, this little ball of stuff, was all without form and void. It was nothing. There's science saying exactly the same thing. But here, Genesis redescribes this matter and space, that's void and nothing, as the waters, which implies and conveys the impression that the matter and space that was without form and void actually still had the properties to transform itself into the universe we see around us. And the next point we have to look at then is, how did that actually happen? And science, their latest theory on how that happened, is called inflation. Right, so although science and Genesis both agree that this initial matter and space that was all squashed up into this tiny minute space was without form or structureless, and it was void or nothing, they both agree that it still had the inherent capability and properties to create the universe and life we see all around us. Now, Genesis signifies that by referring to this matter and space that was without form and void as the waters, which implies it has life-giving properties. Science says that even although all matter and space is squashed to a tiny little point, it is still latent with particles and forces. Now, how and what in this mass of matter and space gave it those properties is the point we need to look at. According to Genesis, it was the Spirit of God that moved across the face of the waters. It moved across this ball of matter and space. Scientists today generally subscribe to the theory of inflation, cosmological inflation. And let me try and explain how that works. What they believe is that within this matter and space was a field. It's called an inflaton field. That's inflation without the I, or they also call it a Higgs field. And this field was like a little worm wriggling around in this matter and space until it got into the right position, or in science speak, until it achieved the right value. And then it acted as a negative force against the positive force of gravity, which then blew this little bit of matter and space into what would become the universe. Now, let me read what Brian Greene says, the effect of this thing, this inflaton field or Higgs field was. And this is the way he describes what happened and what the inflaton field does. And he says, it generates a gigantic gravitational repulsion that drove every region of space to rush away from every other. Now, why that happened, they have no idea. Science has no idea. And what Michio Kaku says is this. He says, what set off this anti-gravity force that inflated the universe? And he says this: there are over 50 proposals explaining what turned on inflation and what eventually terminated it. And that is interesting. 50 different proposals. So they don't really know how this happened, why. But Brian Greene is even more specific about that. And he acknowledges that the ignorance of science goes well beyond just what turned it on and turned it off. Scientists, when they try and depict the universe from the origin to where we are now, they draw a little diagram. And the one end is the origin of the universe, and there's a little fuzzy patch they put in there. And this is why Brian Greene says they do that. It's to demonstrate science's ignorance of why there is an inflaton field, why its potential energy bowl has the right shape for inflation to have occurred, why there are space and time within which the whole discussion can take place, and finally, why there is something rather than nothing. Now, with an admission like that of the ignorance of pretty much everything, you can see why it is so tempting for some people, like the intelligent design argument people, to simply substitute God and say, well, God did all of this, and that's why there was an inflation, and that's why the universe is what it is, etc. And that is the big danger, because if science does demonstrate that one of those 50 or more proposals is actually valid, then the intelligent design argument lies in tatters, and that would set belief in God back not decades or centuries, but even more. And that is because they're looking at the wrong argument. Because if science does prove that one of these theories is correct, it will inevitably demonstrate that there was a law that governed something within this mass that caused this effect. And that is the fundamental distinction between the arguments I set out here, the legal arguments, and the intelligent design arguments. Because instead of looking at what the effect of the law is, we should look at how the law came into effect in the first place. Now that may seem like a subtle, artificial, even pedantic distinction. But let me give you an example in respect of human law. If I go out and say, well, I'm going to go and assault this person, yeah, for no reason, I'm just going to go and assault them, and I go and do that, and then I'm arrested and prosecuted and thrown in prison. And I say, well, why is this happening to me? And they say, because there's a law that prohibits you running around assaulting people. I say, I see. So the effect of this law is that if I break it, I get thrown into prison after being prosecuted. And that is the intelligent design argument. But once that law is established, science shows that law is there, then the effect is inevitable. The question must be, how did that law get there and why? That's the importance of the legal dimension to this argument. Because when you look at why do we have this law, how did this law get there, we now look to the supreme lawmaker that passed the law, not the effect of the law, but the fact of the law being there in the first place. And what we see is a parliament, a supreme lawmaker, or in the United States, Congress, passed a law saying it is unlawful to assault somebody. So we need to look at the reason the law is there in the first place, how it got there, not what the effect of the law is. And that's where we get to this fundamental principle that we spoke about in the first video. That's the principle of freedom. And that's the same as the example I've just used. We could say the fundamental principle that governs human affairs is that we're all free. We are only limited by certain laws that are imposed on us. And so that's what we're going to do. Look at this principle of freedom and see how it relates to the inflaton field that caused inflation in the first place. Right. In order to see what role law played in bringing about this initial expansion, we first have to identify what properties governed the inflaton or Higgs field, which is said to be responsible for this expansion. And let me read on that what science says the situation was. And this is Brian Greene again, and he said the uncertainty principle, that's the principle we saw in respect of particles. The uncertainty principle also applies to fields, and so it will apply to the inflaton field. And he goes on to say this: the quantum processes will inject random jumps into the Higgs field's value. So it's sort of like one of those things we see when you're watching a medical movie, the beep, 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 that sort of thing. And it has to get to a specific value. But the problem with that is, these fields are free to choose from any number of positions. And this is how Brian Greene again explains it. He says, this is comparing it with particles. The particle is free to take on this or that velocity, or to assume a mixture of many different velocities. For fields, the situation is similar. So what that tells us is that fields are also free. In other words, the principle that determines how fields behave is exactly the same or similar to the situation with particles. And so that puts freedom as the fundamental principle that was governing the Higgs field at that time. Now, we also know from what we saw in the first video that if freedom is a fundamental principle, you can't have something else, some other aspect or some other field coming along and forcing this field to do something. Because freedom is the fundamental principle of the particles and of the fields. So the question then becomes, how do you get from a position where they're free to do whatever they want to a position where we have the world we see all around us today? And the question is, I think Green again puts it quite well. He says, yeah, what we really need to try and work out is how the fundamental laws of quantum physics morph into the classical laws. And the classical laws is what determines how everything is all around us. Now, what we know from Michio Kaku, as we saw in the first video again, is the fundamental basis of the quantum laws is free will, as he called it. That means we need something else to impose on that freedom a law that determines how it behaves. But not just that, not only do we have to manipulate the freedom or the probabilities, as Michio Kaku says, and we remember he did say that scientists recognize it is possible, or it should be possible, to manipulate these probabilities. So what we have to look at is to see how that could have been done and what quantum physics tells us is needed for that to be done. Right, so let's see what Genesis says about what happened next and why. And it says this: "And God said, let there be light, and there was light." Now, of course, science, as we've seen, doesn't know, and they accept that, how this inflation field was activated. But clearly, according to Genesis, it was the intervention of God. But that must mean imposing a law on something that is otherwise free to do as it pleased, just as we saw with the question of freedom and the prohibition against assault. Once that happens, science and Genesis agree 100%. As we've seen, Genesis says, when this happened, everything turned to light. There was light. And science, their explanation goes something like this. When the initial inflation occurred that then created the Big Bang, it produced billions upon billions of particles and antiparticles. And when the particles and antiparticles collide, it forms a photon of light. And so science acknowledges that the universe would have then been filled with light. What they don't understand is why there was anything left. And let me refer to Brian Cox and Jeff Forshaw. This is their book, Why Does E Equal MC Squared? And this is what he says. He says, the question, why is the universe not just filled with light and nothing else, is still open-ended. And that is a question because it should be that there are an equal number of particles and antiparticles, and so they should cancel themselves out. Why anything was left, and we know something was left because that's what we're made of, particles, they don't really have any idea. There are a number of suggestions. One is, as the universe cooled, that the collisions weren't taking place, there were some particles left over. Another explanation is that in some particles, the antiparticle deteriorates faster than the particles, so there would be an excess of particles over antiparticles. Others say that some antiparticles disappeared into another dimension, leaving these particles. But the one thing they both agree on, science and Genesis, was that the effect of the inflaton field being activated is that it created an awful lot of light, but it also left some particles so that we could start now building the universe with what was left over. And we need to have a look at how that happened and why it has maintained itself. Right. Well, the Bible, Genesis, explains how all this happened like this. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. That's an incredible verse, because what we saw when we looked at the principle of freedom and the quantum laws that govern the behavior of particles, and now we see in fields as well, is that there are two elements to that. The first is that particles or fields are free to choose from any number of probabilities, but they will only form a fixed position, take a fixed position, in other words, choose one of those when they are observed. And there we have, in the first day, a reference to an observation, because "and God saw" can mean nothing else but an observation. And what it's saying there is God saw the light, that it was good. In other words, he locked in the amount of light, and that left darkness. And that darkness is clearly referring to the particles that were left over, the stuff that had been converted from the matter and space we had at the beginning into light. This was what was left over. And this locking in is fundamental. Otherwise, we could not have had the world, the universe, us, everything we see around us. And let me refer again to Martin Rees. And here he's talking about this excess of matter over antimatter. And this is what he says. As Sakharov, that's the Russian scientist, as Sakharov points out, our very existence depends on an irreversible effect that established an excess of matter over antimatter. And that's exactly then what Genesis is telling us, that the excess of matter over antimatter was that an observation was made, and God saw, at a crucial time in the origins and development of the universe. It was at a time where just enough particles were left over that it did not leave a situation where if you had too many particles, gravity would have pulled itself together again, and we would have been back to our gravitational singularity. On the other hand, there were not too few particles, because if there were too few, they wouldn't have formed together, and the universe just would have expanded, and nothing could have been brought together to create the structures we need that form the stars and the planets and indeed ourselves. So it is quite remarkable that at the precise moment that would leave enough particles to create the universe, Genesis is talking about the intervention of an observation, and God saw. Right, so at this point, before we get to the final verse, let's just recap what's happened. We start off with matter and space that is condensed into this ball. It's referred to as a void. It's without form. Science calls it structureless, primordial chaos, or simply nothing. However, both science and Genesis agree that it had the latent properties to create the universe and life we see. Then what we see is that these fields, or this field, the Higgs field or the inflaton field, is somehow activated, and that creates billions and billions of particles and antiparticles, and they all collide, leaving light, but there's enough particles left over. Now we should remember what Brian Greene said. The important thing to work out is how these quantum laws that governed this initial state of things transformed into the classical laws. That's the laws that govern the universe we see all around, that make it possible for us to measure things, that give us day, give us night. And the amazing thing is, at this particular point, again, Genesis steps in and identifies the moment when those first classical laws were established. And this is how it does that. And it's very interesting. And it says, "And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night." Now, day and night are both in capitals, and the evening and the morning were the first day. Now that's important. And God called the light day. There we have a capital. And the darkness he called night, again with a capital. There's only two other times in Genesis where this naming with capitals takes place. And one is in verse 8, and God called the firmament heaven. And the other one is at 10, when he says the waters he called seas. Okay. Now, why that's important is by calling something day and night and emphasizing it in that way, what it's showing is something had been made irreversible. It's sort of the as night follows day, as day follows night syndrome. It tells us that something now is governed by particular laws. That is clearly the way Genesis is saying the quantum laws, or certain aspects of those quantum laws, had now been transformed into the classical laws. And the way that happened, according to Genesis, which fits exactly with the science, is the probabilities, the freedom of particles and fields to do pretty much as they pleased, had a law imposed upon them by way of an observation. And that observation, according to Genesis, came from God. So God imposed this law that started the classical universe as we know it getting underway. Now the second part of that is the evening and the morning were the first day. And that is clearly telling us that time had begun. The clock started ticking for the universe. And putting it as the evening and the morning is a very interesting way of doing it, because it's also telling us that the way you measure time is from a fixed point, just as we do on Earth. For Earth time, we measure it in relation to the sun. And the revolving of the Earth on its axis and the Earth going around the sun gives us hours, days, years, etc. But when we talk about time, if I say at 9 o'clock I arrived at work and I left home at 7 o'clock, what we're doing is saying 9 from midnight, that's at a certain point where the Earth and the Sun are in a certain position, is 9 hours. I then look at the second part, 7 hours, and I subtract the 2. And that's exactly the way they calculate space-time, or space-time interval. The focus, the central point in space-time is the Big Bang, when it all started. That is the fixed point from which we measure. And the way we measure is we say, this is the evening, this is now, and the morning is the Big Bang, when it all started. So all it's doing there quite clearly is saying the evening and the morning is telling us time has now begun. So time is a function of motion. It is a function of the expanding universe. Right, before we wrap up day 1, I just want to address one further issue, and that's in verse 4. And it's the second part, and God saw the light, that it was good. By using the word good, Genesis is quite clearly trying to convey the message that there is a moral element to what happened in day 1. And that moral element clearly relates to the fact that the freedom inherent in the quantum properties that govern the material at the origin of the universe, the beginning, the material that was void and without form, had been converted into material that was now subjected to a law. That was the light and darkness, photons of light and the particles that were left over that would create the universe. So what that gives us is the very first principle, the principle of freedom under law. Now the second thing to just mention again is what we talked about at the beginning, and that is the basis of mathematics had been established. Because we started with substance, the heaven and the earth, matter and space, which has now been transformed into light and particles that we're going to create the universe that we see and life as we know it. And we know that because, as we will see as we go into the next days, every time something happens, we find that Genesis is telling us the material that was already there is going to be used to create the next stage. It's just going to transform, and it transforms by other laws being imposed on the freedom that is inherent in the quantum principles that govern particles and fields. And so what we see at the end of day 1 is science and Genesis agree exactly on what was there at the origin of the universe and what happened to transform it into light and into the particles that make up the universe and indeed our own bodies. The only thing they disagree on is how and why it happened. Genesis clearly refers to God, and as we've seen, scientists say they have no idea where this material came from or why it suddenly converted itself into light and matter and expanded space in the way that it did. But we are not finished yet, because there's still further aspects of the quantum principle of freedom that had to have a law imposed on them in order to start building life. And that is what we're going to look at with the next day and the concept of expansion.